You are listening to an SAFM podcast, 104 to 107 nationwide. Stream us live on www.safm.co.za or via the SABC Plus app. SABC News, independent and impartial.
It's quite disturbing to see what is playing out in our schools. And I wonder, in your view, when you look at some of what you've been able to find, what could be the reasons behind this?
I think for us as the Center for the Study of Violence and Reconciliation, we always ground our work in the research that we do, right? And I think in this instance of school violence, we need to look at the broader drivers of violence in South Africa. And our research shows that there's no single cause of violence in South Africa, but rather several sort of factors that come together in different ways in the communities that the students come from, or rather in communities that the learners come from, right? And these different drivers range from context to context that enable violence. And the most significant one includes social and economic inequality, frustrated masculinity, lack of social cohesion, alcohol, and firearms in communities. So in order for us to start having a conversation about violence in schools, in places of work, we need, or rather how to prevent these different forms of violence in these places, we need to address its effects in a way that we firstly understand its drivers. We need to understand how these multiple and intersecting factors converge to result in the violence and how it plays out in schools as well.
And you talk about a deep engagement and an unpacking of this culture of school-based violence. What would the unpacking of it entail, and how uncomfortable should the conversations be getting?
More than anything, I think the script is always the same. So every month or so, we wake up into the news of another, for example, violent incident in our schools, right? What always happens next, rather whatever follows next, is very similar, right? The school in question responds with a statement, speaking to those who experience the violence or the racism within the school. There's also social media outrage, or rather social media outcry that comes out in media. That follows through, but there's never a question of why did this incident happen, right? And also the Department of Education also released a statement condemning, and then it ends there, and then it dies down. But what we're saying is that there is more that needs to be done. More meaningful conversations need to have, with deep-seated conversations need to happen when it comes to addressing this. So as a community, or rather as the school, they need to create safe spaces for dialogue and critical conversation, right? And it is one essential step to addressing violence, to addressing racism in school, where they create safe spaces for open and honest discussions on these issues.
And when you look at the road travelled by South Africa, it's over 30 years of our democracy, our 31st year now, and there are still some issues, particularly when you think about a number of schools around, racist slurs, her issues, violence, and all of that. And one wonders then that the schools themselves, are they creating enough room or even platform for some of these conversations to be had at school level as well?
I think there isn't much that is being done regarding speaking about racism, speaking about violence in schools by the department, or rather within the education system. Our first step is acknowledging that racism exists, right? And our education system remains very much riddled with inequalities and numerous systematic challenges that we need to look at and that we need to address, right? And our inability to address the historical legacies of racism within education is one of the main factors behind the persistent racism and violence that we see in our society today. We could look at the history of violence in South Africa itself, outside of the racism, and those are some of the issues that come out of there are things that we haven't addressed as a nation, right? And we also need to know that at a societal level, right, much more needs to be done, but also at an individual, family, community level, where we create a non-racial society in South Africa. Children in the schools mimic what they hear, what they see in the environment, and more needs to be done to ensure that we do not tolerate intolerance within the schools or even these racial slurs. So it's broader than the schools, than the schooling system, but also goes back to the communities and South Africans at large in terms of how do we address issues of racism, and also acknowledging that racism still persists within our country.
And Gugu, when you talk about that, you mentioned something that, children mimic what they hear. And it takes us back to the awareness of all of us at the table. For example, if we're sitting with our children and the conversations that we would be having and the framing of it, therefore, in order for them to at least be able to engage with issues in a much more open-minded manner, I suppose.
Definitely, I think it is something that we need to be very, very intentional about it, right? Going forward, I think it's important that we have mandatory anti-racism education and deeper engagement with apartheid history in our schools, right? And how we go about addressing this racism in schools, and also for both learners and teachers. It's not just a learner also issue, because there's that, right? And our history of apartheid and colonialism and slavery points to the fact that we have to address these issues that play out within our schools, and also targeting those who are mostly impacted as most in creating these safe spaces.
Gugu, thank you so much for your time, and I certainly do agree with you. It's important to talk about these and really just unpack these conversations and truly have some deep engagements that could lead to some uncomfortable discussions. That's Gugu Nonjinge, the Communications Manager at the Center for the Study of Violence and Reconciliation.
You can find SAFM Current Affairs on 104 to 107 nationwide. Our podcasts are available for download on all our digital platforms. SAFM, leading the conversation.